Hi, everybody. Welcome to Your Life Projectized. Today is episode number 27, and it is called Unlocking Your Brain's Filing Cabinet, Mastering Personal Knowledge Management. And we're going to talk a little bit about how mastering personal knowledge management, what exactly does that mean, and how does it tie into project management? I have a special guest on the line today, but I want to mention, if you recall, this podcast used to be called Paramjeet Speaks. It was named after me, your host, but I recognized that a better title was available that really emphasized what this podcast was about, and hence Your Life Projectized was born. So when Paramjeet Speaks was the podcast name, I had today's guest on for an episode, but very unfortunately, as it sometimes happens, uh, we had a little hiccup with technology. So we are shooting that episode again today. And I'm so very happy to re-welcome our very special guest today, Allen Tyson. Allen, please say hello, introduce yourself, tell folks what it is that you do.
Oh, hey, nice to see you again. Yeah, thanks for having me back so we could re-record, which is awesome. My name is Allen Tyson. I am a network engineer, and I will say I'm a network engineer and I work for a municipality. Just kind of leave it at that. But as part of
Okay.
that, I'm responsible for network operations, network management, kind of being the network architect behind several different things. But that also has some project management components. It also has, the ability to have to track what I'm doing over time, and that's really what got me started looking into the modern ways of personal knowledge management and how people are tracking some of the things they do, as opposed to maybe some of the legacy ways that it's been done or that we've done in the past.
Absolutely. And I love that. And I think this conversation is going to be so insightful because I know, especially for, I think, number one, I think personal knowledge management is important for everyone, right? In our daily lives in the business world. But I think, especially for project managers, because we are dealing with so much information on a regular basis. We have so much information, so many different areas of knowledge where we're either transferring knowledge or we're receiving knowledge. I think this is going to be a great conversation. So first things first, I want to ask you. So for folks that are on the line that maybe don't understand exactly what is personal knowledge management, I mean, can you share a little bit about that? What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I talk about personal knowledge management, or not just when I refer to it, but if you ever Google it, you kind of look some of these
Hmm.
things up. It's really the ability to take the information that you have, take
Hmm.
what you've documented, information that you ingest, and put it into some sort of structure where you can search that information and then make it actionable. So, for example, we talk about projects. If you've worked a project
Hmm.
and you have all these different lessons learned, all these different things that you think next time when you do that project it would be better. Or from this project you decide or you learn that there's additional pieces of information that you need to learn. Well, you put all that in a personal knowledge management repository, and there's different softwares that you can use. There's several different ways you can do it. And then the next time you get ready to search or do a project or do another deployment, you can now pull from that repository of information. If you read a book, right, how often do you read a book and then maybe 6 months or a year goes by and you think about that book and you can't remember much of what you read except for maybe some of the highlights?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if you're using personal knowledge management system, you're taking the highlights from that book, you're taking the things that resonated with you, you're putting them in a system where you can recall that information, and then that gives you the ability to create a framework and say, oh, I read this quote from this book. This person said this. I want to apply it in my life. Here's that information. Instead of just investing time having experiences, but not being able to query the results of those experiences.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. And so obviously that fascinates me because that first of all, I love efficiency and I love being able to really pull the data that I need when I need it, and to be able to pull it quickly and really to just to get the highlights, because sometimes I don't want to sift through all of this data. So Alan, what are some tools tools for personal knowledge management that either you have experience in or that maybe you may not have used, but that are out there that folks can maybe look into?
Yeah, no, definitely. So there's several different tools that are out, and as things have kind of progressed, more and more tools have been released that have this core functionality. And I don't know if we have time, I might be able to give you just like a quick demo of like my system and how I do some things. But I would say you have tools like Roam Research. That's what I use personally. It's a paid tool, and
Mm-hmm.
it's built on this concept of kind of backlinking, where if I'm inputting data into the system, I can tag certain things based upon what I consider to be important. And then when I need to go back and look at those things, I can pull the data. So, for example, I might have lessons learned from a project. That's a tag that I use. I use lessons learned across the board. But then I'll tag things like Juniper and Cisco. I'll tag first floor, second floor. I'll tag different department names. And so now when I have to do another project, I can go back and look at here's all the things that did not go well that are related to Cisco, that are also
Mm-hmm.
related to Juniper, that are also related to deployment. And then before I start my next project, I can very quickly look at the things that went well, make sure I replicate those things. And then the things that didn't go well, I can immediately put those up front and make sure those things are addressed. And so Roam Research is one of those pieces of software. LogSec is a free open sourced version of, Roam Research essentially. It does the exact same thing. You have software like Obsidian, kind of built around a similar framework. You have
Okay.
Tana, built around a similar framework. So there's these different groups of personal knowledge management software that have come along in recent years, and they're drastically different than the things like Evernote or OneNote, where you're taking these notes in a static system that
Mm-hmm.
don't have a relationship between them. And these softwares, you can think of them like a graph database where these different pieces of information are connected to each other. And by finding this piece of information, you're
Mm-hmm.
able to find these connections. So maybe you can't remember everything related to a project where you made this mistake, but you can remember one piece of it. As long as you can remember one piece of it, then you can go back and pull all the associated tangential information.
Oh, that's lovely. And I know that this again, so this is going to resonate with the PM community so much because a lot of us PMs will can attest that oftentimes, yes, and we document all those things that you just mentioned, right? We'll document what the project was about, we'll document what went well in the project, what didn't go well, what could have been done better, etc. But I think it's painful, right? Similar to what I was just sharing a little while ago, it's very painful to now go through all of that documentation and really have to figure out, okay, well, these are the things that went wrong. Let me make sure I avoid them, but really quickly pull up that information. I mean, there's several tools that make it a little bit easier, but I'd not heard of personal knowledge management before, so I'm fascinated. But that brings up another question in my mind, Alan. So, what is the difference? So, I've used SharePoint before, right? And I know in SharePoint you can use certain tags similarly to what you were just explaining to pull up data that you are, look to pull up specific data. How does personal knowledge management, how do the tools that you were just mentioning, how does that differ from what SharePoint already does?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when you think of something like SharePoint where you're tagging things, and maybe you want to tag something like lessons learned, or you want to tag something like Nexus or Core, you go and you do a search for that specific tag, you pull that information back. But if you want to create a relationship, let's say between Nexus and lessons learned and failure, well, then it becomes a little bit harder to track because now you have to physically put in the tags
Mhm.
that you want to pull back, right? You have to specify what the information is. With a graph style database or using some of the modern personal knowledge management tools, when you're tagging those things together inside of a project, automatically those things immediately become interlinked. So you don't
Hmm.
have to know the three different pieces of information required to bring back that one thing you're looking for. You only have to know one of the three. The other thing that makes it incredibly powerful is now, as you start doing that, you can pull up this web of knowledge and say, show me all of the interconnections that exist between any time I've ever put anything in about a lesson learned, or any time I've ever put anything in about Cisco. show me all the times I've put something in about Cisco, and show me the relationship to a lessons learned, and show me the relationship between a failure. Now, again, you have this web of knowledge that you can pull from, which makes it a little bit different than how SharePoint is structured database wise. The other thing that you can do as well is it'll actively go through the database for you and it'll say, you used Cisco as a tag many times. There's all these other times that you've also used Cisco. Would you like me to, by the click of a button, tag all that information for you as well? So now these random notes that you might have taken that you didn't think were related to what you were looking for, the software recognizes and says, hey, based upon how your brain works and based upon how you've been tagging things, you probably want to tag these other things too. It'll let you then click a button and tag all those things. And then let's say, for example, you want to go back and maybe you think, this tag, lessons learned, I want to change that tag to actionable items. Well, if you're putting a tag or something on a document in something like SharePoint, it's a static tag based upon each one of those individual documents, right? You have a document you tag, you have a document you
Mm-hmm.
tag. You don't really have a clean way to go and find every single instance of that tag and change it. In modern PKM software, you can say, I want to change lessons learned to failures. And with the click of a button, it'll automatically go out and it'll change not just failures, but all those associated relationships to it. So as you start to hone your process and start to hone how you want things to be defined, you can, with the span of a couple, with the click of a couple buttons, change that across your entire database. And then it shows you a graphical web of knowledge and says, here's all the times you've referenced this, and here's all the times you've referenced this, and it gives you the ability to see how you're thinking about specific things. And I would, say, and then I'll stop because I'm pretty excited about it. But I would say
Yeah.
the other thing too is within, these modern tools, you're using the journaling feature, right? So I journal every single day and I journal about my successes, about my failures, what went well, what didn't go well, and I try to come up with a way to appreciably improve over time and get better. And so, since you're journaling inside the software, now you're saying things like, I read this really good article on neuroscience. I read some new opinions on the Dunning-Kruger effect, and here's some of the things that I took away from that. And you can tag those specific things with tags that you're already using for projects. So now, when you go to say, okay, let me prepare for this project, show me anything related to, let's say, Juniper, show me anything related to whatever it is you're looking for. But I know that I took some research on what people are doing currently when it comes to managing projects in this space. Pull that back in for me as well. So now the new things that you're learning that normally are in this silo over here, you can now pull from that, you can pull from the lessons learned and you can pull all these things back in one web of knowledge and then say, okay, based on all this data that I have, now I'm ready to create this new project and I'm going to leverage these things. Right. And then I would just say probably the last thing too is that, something like SharePoint or, some of these more legacy type of tools, SharePoint typically exists in a repository that's
Mm-hmm.
maintained by a corporation or
Yeah.
by an organization. So
Yeah.
if you leave that organization and you've worked on a project and you've decided to put all your personal lessons learned for ways that you can improve on a project, things that you think you want to look at going forward, if you're not putting that in your own personal repository, then all that knowledge, all those things that you learn essentially stays with that organization when you leave. So if you decide
Yeah.
you want to move to another organization and you had some great lessons learned, some things that you went through, a lot of things that you think would help you moving forward, well, if you don't have your own system to put it in, then you're trying to remember, wow, I was at this last job. We had a similar lessons learned on this thing. Yeah, they used the same equipment, but what was it?
Oh,
Now you're
yeah.
relying on, your memory, which if you didn't come up with a plan to remember information, according to, Dr. Herman Ebbinghaus, who did like a study on how we forget, which has been replicated over time, you're going to forget about 50% of everything in the first couple hours if you don't have a strategy to review it. So by putting it all in one place, you're able to leverage knowledge and experience throughout your entire career each and every time you get ready to go to do a new project, which is also something that if you're relying on a centralized tool like a SharePoint managed by somebody else and you leave, all that data
Yeah.
goes away.
I mean, it's honestly, it's so true. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I've begun work on a new project in a new organization, right? Well, so as I'm a consultant, whether it's with a company, right, where that I'm employed with, or if I'm doing a quick project as a consultant, there are so many times that I wish that I could refer back to projects that maybe I've done with company B. When I'm working with companies, I wish I could pull that information, but obviously I left it with company A, right? So I no longer have access to that information. So it would be, I mean, I think this is terrific, because to the point you just made, if I try to recollect the project that I worked on and say, you know what, let me think about what all the things that didn't go well. Maybe I'll remember one or two of those things. There's no way I'm going to remember all of those things, right? Our brain only retains a certain amount of information. And so you also mentioned a term, and I remember you using this term the last time we spoke. So I definitely would love for you to touch a little bit on this. So I think you said spaced repetition optimization. Did I get it
Yes.
right? Okay. So tell me, or tell the audience a little bit more about that. So, what is spaced repetition optimization? And how can we use it, not just in project management, but just in our everyday lives? Yeah, how can we use it?
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to like a conversation that we had before, and what I had mentioned not too long ago about Dr. Herman Ebbinghaus. So
Okay.
neuroscience in just recent years, the way that we've learned about our brains and about meta learning and about how we think and about how we retain information has really changed quite a bit, right? I mean, once upon a
Hmm.
time, we thought there were things like learning styles and that you were either an auditory learner or a visual learner or a kinesthetic learner. And we found out over time that that's just simply not the case, right? I mean, that's just not really how people learn. You might have a preference for one thing or another, but there isn't such a thing as learning styles per se. And one of the things that has also been originally discovered like back in the 1800s, but through multiple studies over time has been replicated, is this, Dr. Herman Ebbinghaus was very, very curious to find out how we forget things, like what happens when we learn, but more importantly, what happens when we forget. And so he did this study, using kind of himself in a silo, but it's been replicated and people are at varying end of the scale, but the scale typically is exactly the same, which is if you don't take an active approach to your learning of
Hmm.
anything, um, outside of, maybe if you're learning something that's related to something that you already know, that certainly helps. But if you don't take an active role in learning and reviewing information, then typically after about an hour, give or take, you're going to forget about 50% of what you just came into contact with.
Yeah.
Roughly after about 24 hours, give or take, you're only going to remember about 30 to 40% of it. And then beyond that, there's a stark declination where things go down tremendously and you end up forgetting. And what, neuroscientists discovered after kind of replicating, his work is that since we know when we're going to forget after about an hour, after about several hours, then what we do is we review that information before we get to the point where are about to forget. Then we remember a little bit longer. Then when we are about to forget again, based on the forgetting curve, we review again. And then over
Hmm.
time, what ends up happening is we end up remembering the information longer and not forgetting it. So if we're investing a bunch of time into something, if it's important to us, if we don't do any sort of active recall, we're going to forget that information. And so spaced repetition, whether you're doing it yourself, if you're using something like Anki, which is kind of a free spaced repetition tool, Super Memo, there's other tools that do it that are kind of based on that research. That gives you the ability to remember things longer over time. Because if you don't, you're ultimately going to forget about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll tell you. So something, oh, well, this is not spaced repetition optimization, but I think this would be such a great tool firstly, I think it would be such a great tool or practice for everyone, right? In general, just for people in general. But I will say that I've noticed that the only way I typically remember things is number one, yes, if I repeat that information, if I'm constantly revisiting that information, but also if it's had an emotional impact on me. So if a certain piece of information makes me feel a certain way. I've noticed that that is how I sometimes retain that information, and I will remember, and I will remember very vivid details about that information. I'll remember where I was when I learned it. But anyway, I find this absolutely fascinating, and thank you so much for sharing that. And so. Alan, so you mentioned we talked a little bit about project management, and you mentioned how maybe we could use personal knowledge management in lessons learned, pulling up some of those lessons, revisiting some of that information. What are some other ways that and I recognize that you're not a project manager, but what are some other ways that you think, but okay, let me backtrack and say, I know you're not a project manager, but I know you know a lot about project management. So what are some other ways that you think or you could and that you could share that project managers can use personal knowledge management really to manage their projects and to successfully execute and close on them?
So we talked a little bit about lessons learned, right? What
Mm-hmm.
your successes are, what your failures are. Questions that come out of a specific project. So for example, it's just in my opinion, you know that something failed. Like let's say maybe there were some dependencies that weren't done, or a piece of software needed to be deployed and it failed. Well, why did that happen?
Mm-hmm.
How do you quantify exactly what happened so that it doesn't happen again? Because it's great to be able to say, okay, here's a lesson learned and this failed, but going forward, what's the fix for that? So that
Mm-hmm.
kind of gives you the ability to dig deeper into some things and enhance your knowledge and say, okay, well, this particular piece of this project failed, or this particular piece of this deployment didn't go well. What are some of the things that could have been done? What are some of the things that I've seen elsewhere that were successful in this situation? And then you're able to link that back together. The
Yeah.
other thing is if you're journaling and you're taking some of those notes day in and day out, in whatever PKM tool you decide to use, and you come up with ideas, and you say, this would be great to apply here, or I just read this piece of information here. This would be great to apply to a future project, to a future idea that I have. Again, before you decide to take on a new project, you can go back and say, you know what? What ideas have I had? What are some things that I've thought? What are those shower thoughts that kind of came to me that I think would be better going forward to apply to a project like this or any project before I get started? Any research that you've done, even if it's research personally. So we went and we talked a little bit about reading books. So maybe you read, Be So Great They Can't Ignore You, or maybe you're reading Moonwalking with Einstein by Joshua Foer, and you come across some very specific quotes, some very specific frameworks in that book that you think would be great to be able to use on a project. Well, several of the personal knowledge management tools will allow you to have a book. If you have that book on Kindle, you buy the Kindle book, you can make highlights on the Kindle book. It'll automatically send those highlights into your personal knowledge management software for you and then tag it however you like. So now you can say, you know what? I read this great book by Joshua Foer or by somebody else who's phenomenal project manager who said these are some great frameworks that you might want to use going forward. You can tag it, have it automatically be inside your software. And then as you are getting ready to build out a new project, or as you're getting ready to do anything, for example, you can say, you
Mm-hmm.
know what, there's been some really good research, some really good things that I've read. What was that? Well, see, now that's part of your toolkit because it's in your database. You go to a conference and you're sitting there, and someone like yourself is sharing ideas about here's how you can do this. Here's maybe some different ways to think about that. Where do you put that information so that you can refer to it before you start a project? If you're putting it in a PKM tool, now you're like, I went to this seminar. There was a great framework. I use tag framework that I want to leverage and look at before I get
Mm-hmm.
started. So then you pull that information in. So now you've got information from previous projects. You've got information from books that you've read that you want to be able to use and get better. And you have information from conferences or webinars that you've gone to. And now you're ready to start a new project. And you have all these different vectors of information that you can leverage before you even get started, which is going to put you so much further ahead, give you so much more confidence about what you're going to do because now you have more data that you can leverage instead of just trying to figure out, yep, I heard this at a conference. Where's that note? I read this.
Yeah.
Where's that note? It's all in one place. And then as you put all those things together into one framework, now you can share that with somebody else. So maybe you want to share it with another project manager or a friend and say, Here's what my thought process looks like. This is what I did on this project. This is how I handled it. What do you think? Instead of just asking somebody for general advice on how you can improve, how you can get better, now you can show them your actual thinking process and say,
Mm-hmm.
review this. Here's the book that I read. Here's the information that I put in it. Here's what I got from this conference. I put all those things together. I managed my project in this way. What do you think? And they may look at it and say, yeah, this is really good, but there's actually a new piece of research that shows you shouldn't have done it this way. And yeah, you went to this seminar, but that person later on said to do it this way. And now you can physically show somebody what your thinking is and continue to improve and continue to get better. So I think if you approach it from the standpoint of it's not just for project management, it's not just for notes, it's kind of like a life operating system where you're putting all these things together, then you can continue to get better over time and appreciate.
Wow. Wow. I'm just like, as you're talking, I'm just like, oh my gosh. How, firstly, how, and I think this is incredibly innovative, but I also feel that what a time saver. So, right, we have AI, which saves us as PMs, especially, I mean, it saves everyone time, but as project managers, I know it is great utilizing AI because it saves us a lot of time on some of those mundane tasks. But now, as you're talking about personal knowledge management, I feel like that is another great tool that would save us so much time on some of the tasks that we do and digging through some of that information. And so now I'm curious about this because as you were talking, I kept thinking, I was like, huh.
Yeah, and
I
AI
would
is a great
I
use case. We could definitely talk about that because there's some things you can do with that. But anyway, go ahead.
Oh
Sorry.
yeah, yeah, no worries, no worries. Oh yeah, I could talk about AI all day. I absolutely love it. In general, but also in project management. But I was thinking about as you were talking, because you said that you bought you got access to a personal knowledge management tool. That's something that you pay for. I'm curious, from a cost standpoint, what does that, and I realize it's going to depend on the vendor and maybe the bells and whistles you want in the tool. But uh, what does this kind of tool typically run somebody?
Yeah, so I would say this, like I use Rome Research and I think it might be like 15 bucks a month or something like that,
Okay.
somewhere kind of in that price range. But Rome was, I want to say, an early pioneer in this idea of sense making and this idea of personal knowledge management and backlinking. And while I still use it and I think it's a fantastic tool, there are other tools that you can use that will give you similar functionality. So you could use LogSec. LogSec is 100% free, open source. You can download it on your machine. If you want to sync it up to the cloud and then have it sync to multiple sources, there's a cost for that, but you can get started with zero cost. You could use Obsidian and get started with zero cost, right? So it really depends on if you want that information to kind of sync up to the cloud and then push
Hmm.
down to like your phone or push down to your laptop or push down to multiple machines, then that's where you would get into like a minimal cost for something like LogSec. But just to get started, just to use it, it's free. Roam is 100% software as a service, so it's all online, right? That's
Okay.
important to you. That's an option. Obsidian, that's another option. Tana is a newer piece of software. It's a SaaS service. That's an option. So you can really get started at zero cost by using something like LogSec. Start getting your ideas there. And because they're built on a similar framework, if you wanted to export it out to Rome later, export it out to a different, system, maybe syncing is important to you, maybe it's not, then you can change. But you don't have to make any sort of initial financial investment at all to start documenting these things in a structure exactly like we talked about and being able to reference it.
Okay, awesome. No, thank you for sharing that. And how secure is your data in this tool? I mean, something I will tell you, and I think a lot of people typically have this concern is when I'm entering my data into any tool, especially a software as a service tool, there's something that's on the cloud. I'm always worried about, well, who has access to my data? And so how can I ensure that I'm choosing a tool that has built in those safeguards to make me as a consumer feel comfortable that, hey, you don't have to worry about your data being misused because your data is safe.
So with something like, what I use, which is like a software as a service, you have the ability to do total graph encryption or
Okay.
not. So you can essentially create a graph, and when you create a graph, it's private. You have to sign in with a username and password, but the data itself isn't encrypted unless you encrypt it. So for the graphs that I use, I make sure that I always encrypt them. And I'm the only one that has the keys, according to Rome, I kind of have to trust what they say, but I'm the only one
Yeah.
that has the keys to that specific data. So when I sign in, my graph gets decrypted and I have everything. I also have some graphs that I use offline specifically. And those offline graphs only exist on my machine. So within the software, it kind of gives you the ability to create your own localized graph that exists on your machine. So if I want to do some personal things. I'll put some of those things like in this local graph that kind of sits on my machine. But most of the data that I'm in, and as far as like LogSec and some of the other tools, same thing. Once you start, syncing, there's like an encryption algorithm, but when it's running directly on your machine, then it's essentially as safe as the encryption that exists on your machine because there's no call home unless you force it to call home. But I would say
Got
the
it.
other thing is most of the data that I input from whether it's various projects or some of the things that I've come across, some of the lessons learned, they're not anything that's company proprietary. They're bits of data. Like
Okay.
for example, Netbox, which is an open source piece of software, always make sure that if you're going to use Netbox for X, Y, and Z, you don't forget to do this. Because if you forget to do this, this causes a problem. If somebody says that they have pushed a configuration using this piece of software, what I found is that if this flag was not set, then this causes a problem. So I'm not saving anything that's proprietary, but I'm saving like the important bits of data. And kind of to your point, earlier about, AI, which I got really excited about, is now that you're saving all this information essentially in one place
Mm-hmm.
at your discretion, you can export that information out of your personal knowledge management tool and you can import that into something like ChatGPT or Claude and say, hey, here's all the notes that I took on this. Here's all my lessons learned from this particular project, with just maybe non-proprietary stuff. Based upon how I handled this, what is the current state of project management today based on what we know? And what are some things that I could do? Bring back some sources for me. So now, because you've got data that is actionable, now you can plug it into a tool like ChatGPT or Perplexity or Claude or any number of those systems, leverage kind of the framework and get better. You can tell it, you know what, act as a project manager who is
Yeah.
very well experienced with 20 years of experience, use the Socratic method with me, analyze my data, help me to understand the things that I've done well and how I could improve my thinking in projects based upon modern research and show me research, right? So the more data that you have,
Mm-hmm.
now you can take that and leverage it across the board in multiple systems continuously over time and continuously get better. But if you don't have data to give an LLM to be able to query against, then how do you get better?
Yeah,
But by
yeah.
documenting it, now you can.
Amazing. Yeah, no, absolutely great and great point. And wow, gosh, you always have such great insights, Alan. I
Oh,
like
thank you. I
my
don't think
my
so, but thank you.
no, you do. You show yourself some grace. My mind is always buzzing whenever you and I speak because I feel like I have a million questions. But I recognize that we're getting to the end of our time. But there is one question that I always ask my guests at the very end of my episodes. I don't know if you remember this from the
Oh,
last time we recorded, but I wanted to ask you. So thinking about Allen Tyson, the little boy, when you thought about what you wanted to, if somebody asked you, hey, Alan, what do you want to be when you grow up? What was your response? What did little Alan want to be when he became an adult?
so it's interesting. I wanted to be a teacher, right? Just so my oldest sister, ended up being a teacher, and then she went on and she got her PhD and she went to OSU and she kind of did these things, and I always kind of looked up to her because I liked teaching and I thought it would be a lot of fun to like share knowledge. And so that's originally like something that I wanted to do growing up. Later on in high school, though, I really got into wolves and kind of wanted to be a wolf biologist and was looking at going and studying under, somebody who was going to give us a grant to be able to do it. And my dad was like, yeah, no, you're not doing that. You're going to get a real job. You're not going living out in the forest for months at a time. It's not happening.
Yeah.
And then I got into technology kind of after that. But yeah, my original growing up, I mean, sure, I played video games and stuff, but I was never a tech geek. I mean, it just was never my thing. It didn't really come along until much later.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. So I love that. Gosh, how amazing would it have been if you got to spend your life studying wolves? I mean,
I know, right? I mean, that would have been, and I still love, I mean, because you look at like wolves' family structure, very, very similar to
yeah.
ours. Mates mate for life. Unlike other animals, the pack stays together till they get too big and then they go and make their own pack. We found out later on that things like alpha male and female, it's not really how it works. More like a regular family structure. So yeah, I always thought it would have been so much fun. Just because I love animals and I loved wolves and like L. David Meck, who was like just like this awesome wolf biologist and kind of wrote some great books. But yeah, anyway, I'm like getting off topic here, but that's what it would have been cool, right? I mean, so I haven't lost a passion for that, but I think I found some other passions in tech later on that I just probably never would have ever discovered, if my dad hadn't said no.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big believer in life. And this sounds so cliche whenever I say it, but I feel like everything happens for a reason. We end up exactly where we're supposed to end up. And so maybe this is your calling because even though you're not a teacher, in a way you are a teacher, right? You are always knowledge sharing and your insights. I know that I mean, they've definitely made an impact on me. You've taught me a lot,
Oh,
and
thank you.
yeah, you're so welcome. And similarly, I'm sure you've taught so many other people a lot as well. So in a way, that is still the path that you ended up on. Maybe not
Yeah, I never thought
in,
about it, but yeah, I guess that's, yeah, thank you. Wow,
yeah,
okay. I never
yeah,
thought about it like that, but yeah.
yeah, you are so welcome. Well, Alan, I want to thank you again for agreeing to be on an episode of Not Firm Feet Speaks, but Your Life Projectized. I think our audience has going to gain so much knowledge from our session. And thank you again for sharing about personal knowledge management, what it is, what the concept is, what tools are out there for individuals to take advantage. I think this was such a great conversation, and I truly, truly look forward to connecting with you again in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here. And I mean, if anybody has any questions or just want to see how I built my own knowledge graph out, feel free to ping me on LinkedIn. I'll be happy to share it with you.
Absolutely. And as folks know, I always tag my guests. So Alan will be tagged. So as Alan just mentioned, reach out to him if you have any questions. So Alan, thank you again.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you.